There are really no private companies in China, just to let you know, just in case your audience is confused. In every company in China and every office in China, there's a Communist Party branch which directs how things go. Iran's worries should not be economic, because if there was no Western threat of bombing Iran, Israeli threat of bombing Iran, Iran would be doing fine. It doesn't need the Western economy. If we come to the point where more than half of us wants to exterminate our neighbor, what does that say about our humanity? This is not for me to answer.
Please, everybody, give a warm welcome to the esteemed academic, author of important contributions to the global struggle of liberations, such as The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, Red Star Over the Third World, and Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA, amongst many others. His most recent book, I believe it's the most recent, is titled Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle, which is co-authored by Noam Chomsky. He is also the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and has also published many, that institution has published many important contributions as well, such as hyper-imperialism. In addition, he is the chief correspondent for Globetrotter. He is an academic, historian, journalist, and activist. So thank you so much for being here, Vijay Prashad.
Hey, thanks a lot. That was very, very nice of you to say all those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I told you how I feel already, right? so, so, um, so I guess like our idea for the interview, right, is that there's so much change and turmoil going on right now, and I feel like you have being in the field of study that you are in have a really powerful perspective on this, and so we want to start with the bigger picture. Start with how these major powers are interacting with each other, and then go more towards current humanitarian crises like in Gaza. My first question is about the U.S. and China,
Mm.
because in 2020, the current Secretary of Defense of the United States, Pete Hegseth, wrote probably one of the most poorly written propaganda books of all time, called American Crusade. And in this book, he talks about a holy war against the left. And he also said, quote, communist China will fall and lick its wounds for another 200 years. Islamists will never have a nuclear weapon and will be preemptively bombed back to the 700s when they try. So, and it is not just this. In 2024, Joe Biden deployed the Typhoon missile system in the Philippines, which can reach cities in the inland of China, as far as Chongqing. And so my question is, in addition to obviously the tariffs and all of these things going on, why does the U.S. see China as a threat, and how are they addressing this perceived threat?
It's a great question. Let's start with Pete Hegseth first. I mean, firstly, it's a bad idea to write a book in which you say to 1.4 billion people that we want you on your knees, effectively. It's a different matter to say Islamists will never get a nuclear weapon. Okay, that's a different matter, because that's just saying, hey, listen, you're never going to get a nuclear weapon. Maybe he directs that at Iran. I'm not sure, but that's a legitimate thing to say to a perceived adversary. You're never going to get a weapon which is as good as the weapons I have. Yeah, that's a legitimate thing to say. I don't have any problem with Pete Hegseth saying that. He's allowed to say that, my adversary can't have as good a weapon as I have. I think that's a pretty reasonable statement. Nobody's going to be offended by that statement. That's a statement of power and war. But to say to 1.4 billion people that for the next 200 years you're going to be on your knees is unacceptable. Particularly if we can take a historical perspective, particularly given the fact that China experienced what they considered to be 100 years of humiliation from the first Opium War in the early part of the 19th century, right up to the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Long by make films about this, very popular films in the country about a century of humiliation. And here comes Mr. Hegseth and says, forget a century of humiliation. We're going to do 2 centuries of humiliation. I mean, this is unacceptable. I just wonder even if what you quoted is known in China. Probably is known somewhere, but probably not in the internet world. I don't think so. It would have made much more noise. This is offensive, on the surface. Now, if somebody said to me, I'm going to have you on your knees for the next 10 years, forget 200, I would plan to fight back against them. Nobody is entitled to be to create treat other people with indignity. Let's say you're going to try to defend yourself. Now, that's as far as Pete Hegseth is concerned, and I hope that was pretty clear. That in fact there is something grossly offensive in general to say to a people, you're going to be on your knees. But particularly for the Chinese who have this history of humiliation, this is not something they will accept. Now, it is true what the US establishment believes of China. China is a threat to the United States. But I want to be very clear about that. China is not a military threat. It doesn't have, firstly, the military capacity to fully take on the United States. China can defend itself. Now, we just saw with India and Pakistan what 4.5 generation warfare is like. It turned out it was a draw, that when you try to take out another country's air defense systems, the electronic weaponry that is available to countries like India, Pakistan, China, and so on is such. It's not like the US bombing Iraq or the US bombing Libya. The Chinese have air defense systems, have the capacity with those systems to really take out US planes or prevent them, jam them from using electronics, and they'll be flying blind. So China is not interested in militarily threatening the United States. That's not the issue. China is not interested in politically threatening the United States. In fact, it's quite happy with the US pretending to be the world leader. Doesn't contest that. If the US wants to, create some sort of hubbub, Chinese don't get involved in that. Where China is a threat is economically. Whilst the United States has deindustrialized, has allowed the rich to basically sit on all their money, a kind of, financial constipation, as it were, not being put into investment. As that is happening, China, through its state, very strong state, has marshaled its resources to develop high technology and has in many cases taken over the United States. This threatens US multinational corporations. And that's the threat that the United States is trying to deal with. Now, the United States can't seem to deal with this threat commercially, as two trading countries. They just don't have the capacity to marshal investment to improve American industry or to upscale with new productive forces US industry. So it's turned to what the cowboy always does. If the cowboy can't ranch better than you, the cowboy whips out the Colt 45 and shoots you and takes over your ranch. That's precisely what the US is doing. They got the two Colts out. They sent Hegseth, Minister of Defense, Pete, go out there on your American crusade with your 45s, point them at Xi Jinping and say, get on your knees for 200 years. It's not going to work, Pete. You're going to have to go back to your ranch and try your best to get the big billionaires, including Peter Thiel, to actually invest their money in the US. Get them to become patriotic, Pete. Why not write that the American crusade is a crusade to get US capitalists to invest in their own country. Why not that be the crusade instead of telling China to get on its knees?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. Norm?
Yes, thank you. I kind of wanted to ask you, you were saying that China is an economic threat, which I absolutely agree. Do you think, or what do you think those economic, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but those economic repercussions of China surpassing America becoming the largest economy in the world? Because we do know that China has the most means of, or the highest means of production, and the US does import quite a bit of stuff from China. So, how would that change the relationship dynamic between the US and China?
You see, the United States was pretty happy with China for roughly 30 years when China was the factory of US companies. So Chinese workers were building iPhones for the global market. That was fine because China was basically allowing US companies to thrive and expand. But what happened was that the Chinese were pretty clever about this. Firstly, they said to foreign companies, German companies, US companies, Japanese companies, they said to all of them that you can expand your factories inside the United States, inside China, but you can't do this unless you show us the tech. You got to show us the tech. If you don't show us the tech, you just can't do it. So these companies, German, US, French, etc., they delivered the tech. And so then Chinese companies with state support, because that's the nature of the economy, you can't say the state is involved, that's unfair. That's the Chinese system. It's not unfair. That's how they do it. The state is involved. The Communist Party directs everything. There are really no private companies in China, just to let you know, just in case your audience is confused. In every company in China, in every office in China, there's a Communist Party branch which directs how things go. You have to follow the kind of rhythm of the procedures put in place by the state. There is no independence, in that sense. There's no private company. So one just 1 second.
Yeah,
So I mean, there is no like private sector as it were, and so they built up companies like Huawei. It's notionally a private company, but Huawei, Honor. I mean, these phones which people have, like this is an Honor phone. It's a pretty nice phone, Chinese phone. These phones are a fraction of the cost of the iPhone, and they do as much, if not more. The Huawei phone is incredible, and these are cheap. And so these phones can be sold in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and they've wiped out Apple. Nobody can afford to buy an Apple phone. But it's not just phones; it's other high tech. It's things like robotics, and it's high speed rail. It's solar panels. China is the largest producer and exporter of solar panels. It's very high quality magnets and so on. You see, the U.S. economy is premised on rent collection. You have a handful of tech firms that produce high technology. They allow other countries to actually manufacture their goods, Mexico, Malaysia, and so on, some in the US. They allow them and they collect rent. Well, if these other companies, Huawei, Honor, and so on, are biting into their markets, the rents are decreased. And as the rents decrease, Silicon Valley is upset, and Silicon Valley is the driver of the US economy. So that's the real threat. It's that these Chinese companies are now able to produce goods that are as good, if not better, and much cheaper. So why would you in Asia or Latin America buy an iPhone when you can buy one of these? Why would you spend 6, 7 times the price?
right, right. Yeah, I mean, in America, we don't even have the option. They have to ban it. um,
Well, but that's interesting because that's the same in parts of Europe. It's complete mercantile action. You know, the government has said these are illegal. And they have given, arguments about security and so on, but I don't buy it. I mean, security. I mean, come on, Google is checking your data, whatever. That's a dumb argument. They are actually banning it because they would out market Apple inside the US, which is one of the biggest consumer markets. They arrested the chief financial officer of Huawei in Canada when she was on her way to Latin America in a big, a move to expand in Latin America. I mean, this is just using muscle to get rid of an economic competitor. China is a threat economically. It's got no threat politically or militarily. People need to understand that. And even the economic threat is not a threat that's dangerous. It's the threat by the World Trade Organization rules.
Right, right, yeah. I think that was, something really important in your hyper imperialism analysis, showing just how much, I forget the exact numbers, but isn't it like 80% of the world military budget is with the NATO plus countries? And China and Russia combined is very, very small in comparison. Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly correct. In that study, which came out a year and some months ago, it was 74%. But I think your statement now is correct. It's closer to 80%. What's remarkable is Russia is 4% and China 12%, 1.5 years ago. I don't think that has really changed. You add the whole world up, it's 20%,
Yeah.
The United States is near 50%. And that itself is such a glorious waste of resources. Take that money, build some factories, put the people to work to build things that help people, not the means of destruction, whether in, a imagined future war against the Chinese or a current war against the Palestinians.
Right, right, exactly. So my next question, switching gears a little bit, could you briefly explain your reverse Kissinger analysis in the context of Russia and China, and some updates on this, because it seems like it's not really working too well, like you predicted. I think you talked about how Trump wouldn't be successful at this, but it doesn't seem like Putin is really playing ball. So yeah.
It's interesting because you need to go back to understand a couple of things. I'm sorry, I'll take a few minutes to do this.
Yeah.
The first is that until the Clinton administration, until the late 1980s, early 1990s, U.S. foreign policy establishment was largely, a mix of idealists and realists. These are the two schools of political science thinking or international relations thinking in the United States and partly in Europe. Henry Kissinger was perhaps one of the most famous realists, right-wing realists in the United States, who made the argument that, look, you can't change cultures. You can't change the world. The world comes to you as it is. The idealists say, look, we can make the whole world into America, whether by bombing them or by convincing them. We can city on the hill. We are a shining example. The whole world can have American liberal democracy, Jeffersonian democracy, and so on. They're the idealists. I'll come back to them. Kissinger, as a realist, said, no, 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 you take the world as it is. The Chinese communists have a problem with the Russian communists. They're not just communists, and therefore an idealist would say you got to stop communism. No, he said, let's look at the differences. And so let's take advantage of them and let's create a divide, deepen the divide between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. This was his assessment in the late 60s, early 70s, as he watched the border dispute between the Soviet Union and China become more and more a problem. And after the death of Stalin, the rise of Khrushchev created a rift between the USSR and China. So he said, let's take advantage of the rift. Very clever to divide China and Russia. And he said, let's befriend China. we befriend China, and United States and China make an alliance in a sense, and isolate the Russians. That's the Kissinger strategy. Indeed, Henry Kissinger then travels to China, meets Chairman Mao, and Nixon then goes in 1972. It's a very famous Nixon goes to China. Mao is talking about the USSR as social imperialists, and the rift between the USSR and China is complete. So Kissinger was able to actually succeed with the Kissinger strategy in the 1970s. Okay, during the 1990s, during Bill Clinton's administration, foreign policy began to be dominated by the idealists. There were almost no realists. And really, until this Trump administration, the idealists dominated. In the first Trump administration, the principal figure in many respects was John Bolton, who was, a right-wing idealist who believed that you could use military force to overthrow governments in Venezuela and so on, and just bring in liberal Jeffersonian democracy. I mean, he was a right-wing idealist, and there were idealists of the liberal variety, many of them. Don't have to get to their names. With this Trump administration, the right-wing realists are back. Elbridge Colby, known as Bridge, the grandson of William Colby, head of the CIA in the 80s. Bridge Colby is really in charge of the China policy, and he's a right-wing realist. Now, they understood that, look, China and Russia are two countries that have been brought together by the sanctions policy, the pivot to China policy that started in Obama's time in 2011. So, what's happened is that the United States is basically on the assumption that you can take on Russia and China together. And all the US strategic documents say so, that Russia and China are the near peer threats. And they have come together in a partnership, in a no limits partnership signed in 2022. So Bridge Colby says, how do we break that? Well, we're not going to be able to befriend the Chinese. They're not interested. Look, the Chinese have made it clear. There is no Gorbachev in China. The Gorbachev strategy of finding a willing person to basically scuttle the Chinese Communist Party, there is no Gorbachev there. They've looked for a Gorbachev. Gorbachev doesn't speak Chinese. Not going to happen. So let's do the reverse Kissinger, is the attitude. And the reverse Kissinger is that Trump will befriend Mr. Putin, just solve the issue of Ukraine, let the Russians get what they want, stop that war, and then try to break the alliance between Putin and the Chinese and try to isolate the Chinese into surrendering their economic growth. That's a reverse Kissinger strategy. It's a very sensible and smart strategy, yeah? Except, sometimes a dog that has been kicked many times is not going to obey you and understands that you are a kicker. It's going to start biting your leg. Mr. Putin was brought into Russian leadership in the Yeltsin administration as the safe hands who's going to make sure there's no criminal charges brought against Boris Yeltsin, the guy who took over the Soviet Union and destroyed it. Lots of corruption. They handed over private companies for nothing, created these billionaires, whatever. Mr. Putin was meant to be the safe hands, and he was, actually. He was for many years, until 2007, when he shows up at the Munich Security Conference and says there should be no single master, and then joins in the BRICS process, tightens relations with China, and then visits after 2013 when Xi Jinping comes in. They visit with each other almost every year, sometimes twice a year. And they formed a very close understanding of world affairs. Now, during the attack on Ukraine, the Chinese had reservations, and they made those clear publicly about that attack, about the Russian entry into Ukraine. They made it very clear they had reservations. But they actually never criticized the Russians. And it was after that that the No Limits Partnership was signed. There is no indication. And I was a little afraid because there's a section of Russian billionaires who wanted to reclaim their assets that are in the West. And they were putting pressure on Mr. Putin to settle matters with the United States and to slow down the ties with China. Because they have a pecuniary interest in this. But Mr. Putin, I think, brushed them aside. And he has understood that his chips will fall with China. And if Europe basically gives up its obstinates and allows Russian gas to go into China, the Europeans may find that the Russians have actually pledged their gas to go to China and to India, which stood by them during this conflict. There may not be any gas left for Europe, which is actually something Europeans should be thinking about. So I think the reverse Kissinger is not going to work. Now, let's not also be silly. There is a section inside Moscow that is willing and eager to get Mr. Putin to change lanes. But I really don't think they will succeed, although we must pay attention to them. They exist.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
thank you. Oh, I wanted to say thank you for that. I did what do you think Iran's like chips are within all of this? We know that Iran and China have multiple treaties now. And so where does Iran come in to play with all of this? And are they involved? Do you think that they're involved with the negotiations between China and Russia and the US?
So, firstly, I think we need to go a little bit to what happened in Palestine, because when Israel began to pummel Gaza, it turned around and started very seriously attacking both Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, including assassinating Syed Hassan Nasrallah, but also attacking Hezbollah and Iranian targets and Syrian army targets in Syria. What the Israelis were able to do with the United States and European assistance, and also I think the assistance of Jordan, although it's not fully clarified, what the Israelis were able to do was to basically weaken General Qasem Soleimani's resistance strategy of creating or helping organizations on the periphery of Israel to ensure that if Israel or the United States ever attacked Iran, Israel would pay a heavy price. That heavy price has declined. You know, Hezbollah is weaker. The attacks on Syria enabled Al Qaeda to take over in Damascus, and it enabled. By the way, in the markets in Damascus, the old Al Qaeda flag is for sale. You can buy it there openly. It's interesting. So they were able to change the geography around Israel. This is very significant because it leaves Iran vulnerable. If there's an attack on Iran, Iran does not have that secondary ability to strike Israel, which would be very much pushing for the attack on Iran. So Iran is actually in a very weak position right now, and it's clear within Iran. So Iran's relationship with Russia and China and so on is essential. But I think the Iranians are pretty clever. They understand that if the US attacks Iran now, neither Russia nor China can come to their assistance. They might aid them with weapons. You know, Iran provided its drones to Russia. They might aid them with weapons, but I don't think at all that they will actually come in like the Russians did in Damascus, sending a fleet of aircraft to land in Damascus airport and prevent an Obama strike. I don't think they are confident that anybody would come to their military aid. And with the lack of this secondary ring around Israel, they are weak. And I think they're showing it. So, I really don't feel that they are part of this. This talk of resistance, access, and so on, I think it's exaggerated anyway. But also, I feel like now you don't hear people talking like that anymore because it has been, I think they are also a reflection of the weakness of it.
Mm.
Oh, sorry, I think my mic's on. I wanted to ask you as well, because we do know BRICS comes into power here. Do you think BRICS would help economically with Iran? Because we do know Iran is facing a lot of issues economically, politically, especially after the airstrike on Soleimani. I know they're really struggling, and then with the internal conflict that's in Iran currently, um, how do you see BRICS playing into all of that?
part of this is the geography of Iran. I mean, one has to recognize that. To get from Russia into Iran, you're going through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. To get to China, you're going through either Turkmenistan or Afghanistan. So the Belt and Road that China has built relies very much on these Central Asian countries. And you will notice that the United States is trying to play there. This is back to the old great game of the 19th century. These countries have very close ties with Moscow. I mean, you got to understand that this was part of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and many of them still, despite their sort of new orientations, are still the last generation of old Soviet leaders. Second, third rank leaders who were within the Soviet Union are running these countries. You don't have the situation as you had in Eastern Europe, where the whole, apparatus of the People's, Democratic State in Poland was wiped away, and these right-wing parties were formed. Right in Poland, it's only parties of the right. The old apparatus was just swept away in Czech Republic, in Slovakia, and so on. You don't have that in the Central Asian states. These are still the old Soviet Apacheniks who are second, third generation. But coming to my age, yeah, my generation is the last generation of people who would have been low-level Soviet officials, yeah, coming to power. And so these people are very close to Moscow, but they also are very close to China, pragmatically, because China's Belt and Road has been absolutely essential to them. Initially, China and Moscow tussled over Central Asia. But with the ties between China and Russia evening out, I think there's an understanding that China is, doing an economic thing, and Russia has kind of political relations with these countries. But also they have some economic relation, but it's mainly political. Iran relies on this, because Iran cannot rely fully on Turkey or Iraq, on the other side. So it relies on this eastern flank and has very much integrated into China's Belt and Road Initiative. So we'll have to just see what happens. I mean, Iran's worries should not be economic, because if there was no Western threat of bombing Iran, Israeli threat of bombing Iran, Iran would be doing fine. It doesn't need the Western economy. Sanctions from the West hurt it financially, can't reconcile trade and so on. There's no real alternative. But Iran economically is, selling oil to India and, buying goods from China and so on. I don't see, there are obviously economic problems because of the sanctions. But the real thing is the threat of annihilation. If the United States bombs the nuclear energy sites near Tehran, they will also bomb Tehran. And I think that would be catastrophic for the Iranians.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. So I think we want to move towards the Gulf countries and talk about Trump's recent visit. It seems that there was very little, at least so far that we know of, very little political discussions going on there, and mostly economic ones. But I mean, of course, economics is always political as well. But yeah, I'm interested in what you see as the developments coming out of this, and I also wanted to mention that another I read in another famous political scientist, Jason Hickel's book, The Divide. He wrote how after the War of '73, the Saudi Arabia had in an overwhelming surplus of cash from raising the prices of oil, right? And they used this $450 billion surplus to put into Wall Street. And Wall Street used these funds in loan pushing in IMF loans to much of the global South, and place them in these oftentimes permanent debt traps. And so I'm interested in the how intertwined are these economies with the West, with the empire, with the United States, and what are some developments that we've seen from Trump's recent visit there?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I don't even know if Trump's visit was about economics. It was really a kind of show where they made all kinds of statements, and you know, the, the real economic deals take a much longer time because there are negotiations. Everybody wants the best piece of it. You can announce anything. Yeah, if you and I can meet and we can say, look, I'm buying, lot of melon, and you say yes, I'm very happy we're selling it, and then we sit down, and then Noor in the private meeting says, wait a minute, so much is not enough. I mean, we need a cut in future revenue, and suddenly you're caught up in with lawyers, and I just don't think there was any advance. There was a lot of noise. That's classic Trump. Trump is a showman. I mean, he's an incredible showman, and he's got to be. He's incredible. I mean, the way he runs these meetings in the White House, in the Oval Office, with the cameras on. The humiliation of Zelensky or the attempted humiliation of South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa. Such incredible theater. I was in South Africa when he was doing that. And that day, and people had a very interesting reaction. It was again racially divided. The reaction. There was a kind of Afrikaans and white reaction, and then there was a black reaction. And the black reaction was that Ramaphosa did a good job defending South Africa. Which I think he actually did. There were bits and pieces of it which I thought, well, why did he have to bring so many white South Africans? But in fact, that was smart. Bring golfers, to because Trump gets seduced with these things. He's a showman. That's really what happened there. I mean, the Gulf Arab states are not really prone to the US. They don't bow down. I mean, they are also smart and clever and weird. I mean, I don't know if you saw the thing with the women with the long hair, very interesting and strange customs that they decided to put out there to freak Trump out, very clever, clever things. Trump was like, whoa, where am I? Anyway, the point is that I feel that, he thinks that the Gulf Arab states of today are the Gulf Arab states of the 70s, and they're just not. I mean, that's a realization. They are just not, because the Gulf Arab states of today are just not so reliant on the United States. And there's a reason why Saudi Arabia and Iran went to China to do the handshake. There's a reason why the United Arab Emirates hedges its bets between everybody. It's been like that for a long time. The UAE hedging its bets. I just don't think we should underestimate the intelligence of the Gulf Arab states and think, oh, they are just toadies of the Americans. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is building something interesting. They've joined the BRICS, in their own way. They are sort of one step in, one step out. But they're clever. I mean, he's a Bazari politician. Remember, Mohammed bin Salman brought all the rich of Saudi Arabia to a hotel, including my former employer, Ben Talal, the guy who used to own Twitter, and told them, hustle them. Either you give up your money or, you don't know what's going to happen to you. And they walked out, saying Mohammed bin Salman is great, and we're all for his project of Saudi 2030. He's a Bazari politician. That's what they do, right? Put them in a room and say, if they don't agree, they don't eat. And so, I just think Trump is meeting his equals in the Gulf. And they have their own way. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is not unequal with Trump in that kind of behavior. So I don't know how it goes. I think sometimes there is an element of of a kind of racism. We don't want to accept that these fellows are also intelligent and they can spin circles around Trump as well. And just because I might not like the politics of Mohammed bin Salman, I shouldn't underestimate the way he deals with people. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, really interesting. I want to dive a little bit deeper into into the Gulf countries, and particularly, there is a massive crisis going on right now in Sudan. And according to many reports, including some from Amnesty International, have cited Chinese drones being used by the RSF. And the idea is that the RSF got them from the UAE. And the UAE is exporting a lot of Sudan's gold in a black market type of way. So can you in this sense, can we view the UAE as an imperialist power as well? I mean, I think it's interesting you talk about their independence and them looking out for themselves. Like, are these are these imperialist actions?
Imperialism is too strong a word because it sort of it should be reserved for countries with a much bigger footprint, that are able to that are seeking to dominate the world. I mean, given our world today, the geography of imperialism is much greater than the UAE hopping over the Red Sea to Sudan. It's much greater.
Mm.
I mean, the UAE, firstly, before Sudan, has been extremely active in North Africa. It was one of the players in the destruction of Gaddafi and the state in Libya. I mean, they had interests at play there. So did the Saudi Arabia through Egypt. Saudi Arabia effectively has taken Egypt into its hands. General Sisi reports to the Saudi monarchy in one way or the other. It's a proxy state of Saudi Arabia. The UAE has definitely entered the conflict in Sudan, but it's not the UAE's conflict. We should recognize that this is a Sudanese conflict. There was a uprising in Sudan in 2019, which was extremely popular. Around the corner in my office, I have a painting of a photograph of this famous woman standing in Khartoum, denouncing the government of Omar al-Bashir. And that produced its own dynamic, very much like the uprising in Egypt. You had Omar al-Bashir going, just like you had Hosni Mubarak of Egypt going 8 years prior to that. But having left, the military remained intact. And in Egypt, there was a military, and then there was the Rapid Support Force led by another general, which had been used in the Darfur campaign by the Sudanese government of Omar al-Bashir. So these two generals, the general of the Sudanese military and the general of the Rapid Support Force, both were standing on thin ice because they were indictable as war criminals in the previous government. And what does a former war criminal do? They would prefer to destroy the country than be sent, like, let's say, Mr. Duterte of the Philippines to The Hague to sit there in a little cell awaiting a long trial. That's what happened to so many Yugoslavian generals and so on. They don't want that future for themselves. So what do? You start fighting with each other. They also had enormous economic interests that they had already seized, including in gold and in other things, land, gold, and so on. So the UAE comes in to back the Rapid Support Forces general and becomes the re-exporter of Chinese drones. The Chinese are not selling drones to the RSF. Nobody says that. Even Amnesty says that China sells the weaponry to the UAE, and maybe knowingly, and the UAE then re-exports it to the RSF. That's the language used in the amnesty report. Meanwhile, other foreign powers are backing the government in Khartoum. And these two are now basically in a kind of, 1984 war, meaning like George Orwell's novel. They're just sort of stuck in a conflict, backed by foreign powers. Nobody can win. And everybody, including Abdullah Hamdok, who was the last civilian prime minister before this civil war broke out, Mr. Hamdok, who is partly, I think, in exile in Sharjah in the UAE, has been saying external actors should leave, stop backing one or the other of the governments, and we should have a peace agreement, and civilians need to come in and so on. And maybe make a deal. He's not saying this. Hamdok is not saying this. Make a deal with the generals saying, okay, look, we're not going to prosecute you because you're just committing more war crimes to prevent being prosecuted for previous war crimes. So look, why don't you just both go into exile in Saudi Arabia? And you can live in some water port area on the Iranian side. Don't be on this side, and just disappear from Sudanese life. And we'll give you 2 suitcases of gold each, and just get out of here. And I mean, I think a deal like that could be on the table. But these guys are ferocious, and they have militaries, and they think they will prevail. And the general in Khartoum thinks he has the right because he's the president of Sudan. And the general of the RSF, who's a real, hard nut, thinks he can win because he's backed by some really, limitless pockets. He controls the gold and so on. I mean, it's pretty bad for Sudan. Sudan has faced, and I've written about this conflict for over 100 years. And the Sudanese people have really suffered because of it. They are the principal victims of this, and this is a super unnecessary conflict. There's nothing really there except the lusts of old men, as it were.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wow, so much in that answer. I really appreciate it. Norm?
So I actually had a quick question because you did talk about the ports. And I noticed that a lot of the conflicts are on areas surrounding the Red Sea. And you did mention that Saudi Arabia is coming into play there. And we know what Saudi Arabia has been doing to Yemen for the past like 14-ish years. So what do you think the port cities in Africa play in all of this, and what would access to these ports provide these larger powers with? So something else I noticed was Sudan was also on the border of these on these port countries, or countries that have access to the Red Sea. And I noticed that with Yemen, one of the reasons they were so like they had an easier time seizing ships is because they had the chokehold right there between the Red Sea and right near Eritrea. I don't know if we can pull up a map or not, but yeah. So I guess I kind of wanted to see what that would play into, and then how would Ibrahim Traore play into all of this, and how would the Pan-African movement in the context of the neo-colonialism and imperialism that we have been seeing in Africa, how large of a threat would this be to those larger powers?
I mean, you've asked a very, very intelligent and important question. If somebody spends a little time with a map, they will see that some of the most radical things happening on the African continent now are happening in the so-called Alliance of Sahel States, which includes Burkina Faso, whose leader is Ibrahim Traore, Niger, and Mali. Now, the problem for the Alliance for Sahel States is it's landlocked. And landlocked countries or landlocked alliances like this have a difficult time. They have made a deal, and it's the only deal they could make with Morocco to access the port of Dakhla, which is in the disputed Western Sahara territory. I mean, look, these people have no choice. They are landlocked. That was the only option for them. In fact, your question is excellent because the Alliance for Sahel States is capable of making a good relationship with Chad, which is the neighboring state of Niger, and neighboring Chad is Sudan, and Sudan has excellent port facilities in Port Sudan, which is on the Red Sea. And so, in fact, if that whole belt of countries from Mauritania to Sudan were to create a kind of economic alliance, these countries would be able to access the port of Sudan. And if they created a free trade agreement, then let's say Burkinabe or Malian gold would be able to get to the ports, the uranium from Niger would be able to get to Port Sudan and so on, and these countries could share in the profits. This is actually an excellent possibility. But you have to end the conflict in Sudan. I mean, that is key. Without that, this doesn't work. You can't actually get from any of the countries in the Sahel to Sudan, to Eritrea, Djibouti, if the conflict continues in the Darfur region of Sudan, because you can't. There's no way to get there, right? It's a geographical. You can go south into South Sudan, and this is super expensive. Nobody can do that. So yes, the conflict ending in Sudan is a key issue. Because now look at what is troubling the Alliance for Sahel States. On one side, you have the Sudan conflict. On the other side, you have the annexed territory of Western Sahara. You have no choices. You can't go north. These are the Sahel countries. I've actually gone from Niger to Libya through the Sahara. It's not easy. I mean, to trade across the Sahara is not easy. The Sahara is the Atlantic Ocean in sand. It's an ocean. I mean, in Arabic, deserts are called oceans. It is a sea, and it's very hard to traverse. So these countries are, if you want the real Pan-Africanism coming out of the Sahel to flourish, the war in Sudan has to end. It's without a question. There's no other choice. Okay, there is no other choice. But that's a big thing to ask.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, wow. I have to say, I mean, I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be able to ask these questions. It's really amazing. Um, so I can't hold it in. But so I mean, I think next, or actually, another important question, staying on the African continent is the Congo, and I'm really interested in China's involvement with the Congo, because the Congo not only supplies 70% of the world's cobalt supply, but they have many other important resources. I mean, it is often said that that the Democratic Republic of Congo is the wealthiest country in the world, but its people are extremely poor because it is overexploited for a very long time. So I'm interested in this current conflict going on now over the mines and China's involvement in the mines, and it's my understanding that I believe it was 2023 that there was a dispute between the government of the DRC and China over these royalties. One of the largest mines, it's 80% owned by China and 20% owned by the government of Congo. So and there was a dispute over the royalties of this and stuff. So yeah, I'm interested in this. Yeah.
I mean, the first thing is that countries like the Congo, like many countries around the global south, don't really have full sovereignty over their territory. So in the Congo, the country has been in an armed conflict for a very long time. The center of that armed conflict now is in Goma and other territories in eastern Congo. I mean, where a Rwandan-backed force called M23 operates without any problem. I mean, some years ago, I was doing some stories in Uganda, went to the borderland region with the DRC, and the border is chaos. There are people fleeing violence. There's uh, trucks just going back and forth, no octroi duty, no concern about the sovereignty of the DRC, and inclusive the sovereignty of Uganda, because it's happening back and forth. So these countries don't control territory. Secondly, these wars are inflamed and they continue, and it advantages multinational corporations because as the DRC remains in conflict, the longer it remains in conflict, the less control Kinshasa has over the country, the capital has over the country, the less they are able to control how companies behave. And whether they are paying royalties or whether they are using multinational accounting firms to cover their payments, which is really what happens. So these disputes are essentially forever. Countries will forever dispute with the company and so on. This is not a particular scandal. This has become a normal practice, is what I'm trying to say, where a Chinese firm, is dealing with the question of royalties. This is a normal thing. This is not unusual. Okay. The larger problem is the bargaining power. The government in Kinshasa simply doesn't have the bargaining power to control its resources, to control its land, and that is troubling to me. The Western multinational human rights groups always focus on things like child labor, artisanal mining, but they are okay with big companies having so-called regulated mining. It's the individual miners, the petty producers that get hit by the amnesties and so on. But the major mining corporations, some exceptions are there. Some human rights groups do look at them. But by and large, they have a problem with petty producers, not with monopoly companies. And so these monopoly companies are just eating the country. And besides, even these petty producers sell to these monopoly companies. That's how, a lot of the cobalt and coltan is mined by these artisanal miners, so-called artisanal miners, petty producers. And they take their bundle of cobalt or coltan and they sell it to these brokers who then accumulate it and sell it in trucks to the big mining companies.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, do you think that this is Chinese imperialism?
It's a good question, and people should think about it. But the balance, it's what I would think of is trade and commerce and maybe capitalism, but not imperialism. I mean, these are Chinese companies that have come to countries, Africa, Brazil, whatever. They're just buying things. You don't want to sell to them, don't sell to them. They're not setting up military bases and forcing you to act in one way or the other by their military power. They're coming in with money and saying, we want to buy stuff. You want to sell it to them, sell it to them. They are saying, we want to invest. You don't want them to invest, tell them you don't want them to invest. They're bringing money into Africa. I don't think that's imperialism. It's an error to think when money comes into a country that's imperialism. That's just trade. It's imperialism when the money comes with a gun and you say, you got to take this deal I'm giving you. Yeah, it's like, it's the hustle. It's a gangster on the street. Yeah, protection rackets. If you don't pay up, your shop window might break tonight. Who's going to break it, sir? Well, it's a gangster. I can protect you from that gangster. And then they say, well, then don't worry about it, sir. My son he will stand guard for my window all night. Okay, fine. And then the protection racket guy sends his boys and they smash the window, beat up the son. Come the next day and say, do you want to pay me to protect you? Yes, sir, I'll pay you. My son is in hospital. I made a terrible mistake. Well, that's how it works, right? It's the big companies that come in and say, we're going to, we want the deal. And you say, no, we don't want the deal. And then they say, well, be careful. Something might happen to you. US government says, okay, you're not getting a loan. Yeah, if you don't take a US company's deal, we're going to squeeze you. That's imperialism. Chinese don't do that. Chinese just come and say, look, can we do business with you? Say no. They say, okay, we're going to the next country. The Americans don't do that. The Americans say you break the deal with the Chinese. If you don't do that, we'll tell the IMF to screw you. That's imperialism. It's a
Right.
protection racket, you know. It's like the mafia. I mean, Noam Chomsky for years has been telling me the US government effectively is a mafia. I think it's an interesting way to think of imperialism. It's a protection racket. It's a mafia. If you don't listen to us, we'll smack you.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, there's no CIA coups coming from that direction type of thing. Yeah, it's interesting to me because you know, I found it really interesting when you were writing about the non-aligned movement and these whole countries of economic nationalists and things like this who didn't want to be on either the Soviet or Western umbrella, and how what I got a lot from this writing was that oftentimes the Soviet foreign aid packages were not much better than the Western ones. And so this sort of created this space where people said, well, no, like we want to develop our own countries, we want to be independent. Um, it is definitely my understanding that the Belt and Road Initiative has brought in a lot of investment to a lot of places, but it is. I think particularly in this country that is so rich, that is so wealthy, that provides such like important resources for everything that has batteries, all of these electronics, like the whole so much of the modern economy is built off of these things, and it comes from some of the most exploited people in the world. Um yeah, what can I say? I feel frustrated in that there should be more done about it, right?
Yeah, by the way, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon,
Okay.
but this is a very interesting question because, look, firstly, the Chinese didn't create the world as it is now. These countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, particularly Africa and parts of Southern Asia, are very poor, largely through colonialism and neo-colonial exploitation. Chinese didn't do that. So, what can they do given that that's the reality produced by imperialism of the 19th and early 20th century? What can they do? Well, you can't expect the Chinese to show up in, say, Botswana and just give money to the Botswanan government and say, enjoy the money, see you later. Yeah, it's socialist solidarity. That's crazy. They're going to come in and say, look, we'll invest there and we'll give you a good deal, and we'll build a school and we'll build a road and we'll build a train and all of that. That's the bonus, but we're going to have to buy your ore or your gold or whatever. So that's all they can do, even as a socialist country, because the money just can't be given away. That's No country can do that in enormous amounts. You can give a little bit away and call it aid. Yeah, 1% of your GDP or something like that, you could do that. But that's not really what the Belt and Road is about. You want to build massive infrastructure projects. It's way more than the overseas, development aid, ODA, way more than ODA. Yeah. If you're going to do that, you're going to have a rate of return. Sorry, that's just how the world works. Yeah. And we're dealing with poor countries who are going to have to borrow. So what happens is, as poor countries go into default, the Chinese have been pretty generous with haircuts and with loan forgiveness, which ends up being a gift. But that's just not the way to go. I mean, if I was running a country, I don't want to keep defaulting on my loans. I want to very cleverly harness the infrastructural money so that I can start exporting my goods and services and start making, a flourishing economy, so that I can pay off my loans and whatnot. That's how you got to plan. You can't just take the money and sit there. You got to plan a robust, dynamic economy. And that's not on the Chinese, that's on our governments. From Botswana all the way out to, let's say, Pakistan, you got to have a government with a plan, not just a government sitting there and waiting for the Chinese to bring a plan. It's not going to work like that. But we don't have those governments. So we end up in debt. further debt, some of it to the Chinese. You can't blame the Chinese for that. Yeah. I mean, they are building infrastructure for you. The West is different. The West has been lending money to be paid by you, because they demand that the loans that come into these countries, the first claimant on the loan is the creditor nations, and that's them. So they are effectively recycling their money.
Right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Nur?
Yes, thank you. Just jumping around kind of a little bit, just because we know you do have to go. I did want to ask you a little bit about Palestine. And, as we know, the ICC and the ICJ have been coming down really hard on Israel. And now you have Western allies also starting to recognize Palestine. Do these power, like, does this represent a shift in the global dynamics of the world? Do you see like a shift in like US involvement coming to play here? Do you like the Gaza Marine, for example, right? I fully know that when Iraq happened, right, it was all about oil. I know the Gaza
Mm.
Marine has billions of dollars of natural gas in it. So in my theory, it's the US is involved to get access to the Gaza Marine. I could be completely wrong about that, but um, do you think that this is like with the ICJ and the ICC case, do you see a shift in this dynamic at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a shift. I don't want to underestimate that. I mean, the world for the first time is watching countries and multilateral institutions say this is unacceptable. I mean, and that view is now entering even in the West. You know, Narendra Modi of India, who is actually a close friend of Netanyahu, has not been to Tel Aviv. Since after October 7th of 2023. That this is a big shift. Why didn't he go there? Yeah, he's been constantly saying, the only position is the two-state position, same as the Chinese. Very important that they say that, because that protects Gaza from annexation by the Israelis. If you say the two-state solution is over, well, that's what the Israelis want you to say. In fact, yeah. So they don't. These countries are still saying two-state. Why? So something has changed, Noor. I don't want to underestimate that. I don't want us to underestimate it. On the other hand, the United States and Israel are two peas in a pod. It's one of those really dumb debates to have. Who is the dog and who is the tail? Is the U.S. telling Israel to do this, or the Israelis? I mean, it's a dumb question. They are peas in a pod. What does it matter who's driving the debate? Yeah, who's driving this policy? I feel like in this case, the Israelis are working very close, hand in glove with the US and with the British, hand in glove. They're all doing this together. They want Hamas destroyed. They want Hezbollah destroyed. They would like their proxy to be in Damascus, Syria, and not, a proxy of another regional power. Yeah, I mean, Mr. Julani got a makeover in Idlib. He was an Al Qaeda guy in Idlib. I looked at a whole bunch of Israeli think tank reports, and I was, on Syria, and it was so interesting how in these think tanks produced by Israeli research institutes, the researchers went and interviewed him. He was happy to give interviews to Israeli think tanks while he was sitting in Idlib. And then I don't know if you saw Robert Ford, former US ambassador to Syria, who during the uprising in Syria went to them and spoke publicly against the Assad government. It's incredible. US Ambassador Robert Ford, at these things. Well, recently a video of him leaked where he said, he went to Idlib and effectively coached Mr. Julani. And he said that, when he met him, he was uneasy. They sat next to each other. Robert Ford speaks Arabic. He spoke to Julani, and they talked about, what's a good transition for him. And they created this new guy, and they brought him to power in Syria. I mean, he's an Al Qaeda guy inside. Outside, he's dressed in a suit. Changed his name, Ahmad Sharar. Okay, fine. You have a new name and you have a new look, but you are as Al Qaeda as you were yesterday. So, this is what they've all wanted to do, and they're doing it. They're reshaping and kind of demobilizing the allies of the Palestinians. This is what they are doing. I mean, so in my opinion, is it for the gas? Is it for this? Is it for the deal they made with India? You know, the great new corridor from India through Kuwait, through Saudi Arabia, through the port of Haifa, which is owned by a big Indian businessman, Gautam Adani, very close ally of Narendra Modi. He owns the port of Haifa. And then from Haifa to Greece, this great corridor which will challenge the Belt and Road. I mean, is it for that? Because to do that, Gaza has to be prone. To do that, Saudi Arabia has to be able to create a deal with the Israelis. It cannot if the Hamas is still intact, and so on. So there's a lot of interest at stake. Look, this war wasn't something that they planned. Okay, I think the Palestinians did something and provoked this to happen, but look how swiftly they went into it. And I would like to say on the 27th of January this year, the Palestinians really screwed Netanyahu by walking north back to Gaza City. I mean, that was just an act of incredible defiance. And then they've been behaving criminally against the Palestinians who went north. And it's such a point that even Israeli officials are saying these are war crimes. I mean, it's very difficult for the Chinese, for instance, to fly a battalion of planes. Where will they land them? Egypt? No. Saudi Arabia? No. Jordan? No. Syria? No. They can't land planes anywhere nearby to do a no-fly zone, and they can't bring the aircraft carrier into the Mediterranean. The Americans have barricaded the Mediterranean. They can't bring the aircraft carrier up the Red Sea because the Americans dominate the waters despite the Yemeni attempt to take over the Red Sea passage. So, I mean, what are these countries supposed to do? Start World War III? Yeah, maybe they should to defend the Palestinians, but we're really asking a lot right now. And I think as the United States weakens militarily and politically, things will change for the Palestinians. But the victory of the Palestinians may not come in Palestine. It may have to come starting in Washington, where things have to change.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to be respectful, but there's one last question that, I really want to hear your perspective on. There was a recent poll of Israeli society, a famous poll that came out by Penn State University that found that 82% of the Israeli Jewish population agrees with the forced expulsion of Palestinians in Gaza, and 56% agree with the forced expulsion of 48 Palestinians, Arab Israelis. Do you think, I know nobody can predict the future, but do you think that they'll be able to achieve this and get away with this ethnic cleansing of Gaza?
It's a good question. I mean, firstly, I should just say the poll wasn't actually done by Penn State. It was done by one of the most reputed Israeli polling houses. It was a Penn State professor who wrote one of the articles. He was involved with it because I think otherwise the president of Penn State might get fired. So, like all these presidents, I don't really care. Maybe they should get fired. But it is an astounding poll. Astounding if it's accurate, or even near accurate. Let's halve the number, okay? Let's say 40% want the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, and 28% say that it's okay to kill everybody when you take a city. I mean, you can halve the numbers and you can go 1/3 the numbers. It's still extraordinary, yeah? I mean, we're talking about more than half the population of Israeli Jews, because that's the people polled. Didn't include Israeli Arabs. Because there are Arabs who are Israeli citizens or Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. It didn't include them. It was Israeli Jews. It didn't include anybody else. This is a poll on Israeli Jews, which is the vast majority of the Israeli society. So this is an extraordinary moment of self-reflection in Israel. I mean, you need moral philosophers to deal with this. because this is a cultural crisis. This is a population that is in favor of the wrath of God brought on people that they have decided are ungodly and vermin. I mean, we're going back to the Old Testament. Yeah. Let's just turn the city into ash. I mean, this is the Old Testament. This is not the New Testament at all. There is nothing of love here. There is nothing of compassion. This is a moral dilemma. I mean, this is not a political question any longer. This is a question of where is Israel's Jean-Paul Sartre, or Bertrand Russell? Where are these big people? And I'm sorry they're both men, but the point is, where are these people who are going to stand up in the public square, these great Israeli philosophers, and ask the question, are we human? If we come to the point where more than half of us wants to exterminate our neighbor, what does that say about our humanity? This is not for me to answer. This is not a question I can answer. My answer to you is the Israelis need to account for this. Because if the Israelis want to count in the book of humanity, they need to account for this. And for that, you need a moral debate and discussion. This is not for me to answer for them. I was startled when I read those numbers. Yeah, startled, horrified. I didn't expect the 86% to be that, that's high. Yeah, that's very high. There's no room for compassion in that. What are we talking about? 14% of the population say don't do something genocidal. 44% of the population, the minority, is saying don't kill everybody when you take a city. I mean, this really is Old Testament stuff. Yeah, God pointed his finger at that city and it turned to ash. I mean, good God, we don't live in the Old Testament. Yeah, when Job is plagued with all manner of infirmities to prove his love for God, it doesn't work like that anymore. Sorry. Yeah, that's a very arcane form of production that produced that kind of thinking. Yeah, I mean, if you take the book of Job seriously, you don't live in the era of high-speed rail and rockets. You live in the era of a human digging a plow into the earth and hoping you can draw a straight line to plant the few seeds in your hand. I mean, this is that level of production that produces the consciousness of Job because, there's no rain and my seeds are not growing. We won't eat this year. Yeah, that's the form of production that produces Job. Job doesn't exist really in our time. Yeah, even in the most harsh countries, you don't look at your field and say, if there's no rain, I'll starve. There is immense hunger in the world, but there's also immense amounts of food. And our problem is distribution and income and capitalism, which can be surmounted. In the time of the Old Testament, they just weren't producing enough. They could die, and they did, in famine and pestilence and so on. These became the ways that they thought God was pointing the finger. We don't live like that anymore. Stop it. But it's not for me. They need a moral discussion.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You really did make my dream come true today. I've been wanting to speak to you and get the chance to ask you questions for some time now. So I really, really appreciate it. And I think our audience, the comments were going crazy too. I think our audience, this is really your perspective is really important, and I think you helped out a lot of people today.
Well, I'm glad to be with both of you. I mean it. I mean, your sincerity and is charming to me. I mean it. I don't mean that patronizingly. Your sincerity is charming. I mean, you obviously have much sharper understanding of some of these things, but you're so generous to me, asking me. You're just throwing me the ball and saying, hit it. That's what I mean by sincerity. Thanks a lot for that. Thanks a lot. It
Yeah.
gave me the chance to basically lay things bare. Yeah.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, I'm a big fan of your work, of your writing, So, I knew that would be the good way to do it. But yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to, take too much of your time. You've been very, very generous to us, and yeah, thank you so much. I hope to see you
Thank
again.
Okay. again, surely.
Yeah.
Okay, bye,
Sounds great.
bye.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care. And you,
you.
Noor, bye. See you.
Thank you. Bye.
W.
Based.
That was amazing.
It
That's
was
great.
great. It was great. Well, it's okay. We're still on live,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, no, I wanted to add on to that last part where he said this is going to be um, a moral question that has to come into play and that it has to be the Israelis to do it. He absolutely is right. It does start in Washington, and that's actually the plan of a lot of Palestinians. Netanyahu tends to call this lawfare. So instead of warfare, he calls it lawfare, right? Because it's like we're going into the politics. That's why Rashida Tlaib is more dangerous to him that or like Ayman Audit is more dangerous to him than H group out in Gaza um or why it would be more dangerous than anything else, right? Is because once we're in the politics, once we have the representation in the politics, then we're like, hey, what the fuck? But just to add on to his moral question, um, I think Israeli society is cooked. So he was saying that he was shocked when he saw these numbers. I know, I grew up in the West Bank. I'm from Tulkarem, just in case anybody in the chat doesn't know. So we are coming for them. We are coming for them. And I think once we do come for them, we are also going to see we're going to see justice for the entire war on terror, right? Because
Mm.
this is all part of it. It all ties back into the Oded Yinon plan, which is reshaping the entirety of the Middle East. Now, I don't know if Syria is actually going to be included in that because technically that is part of their war on terror. They just didn't frame it that way. Um, but I did just want to say we will definitely get justice for it. We are coming for it. That society is absolutely cooked. Just the way that they even treat us at the checkpoints, right? I remember we got held up for 12 hours before at a checkpoint, and I saw a woman go into labor, have a child, and then they still did not let her go to the hospital even after having the baby. And
Wow.
so we just were there. We were all just witnessing it, and this is not something that they're going to be able to get away with. They are a highly militarized society, and it's a highly militarized society of I know we're streaming live on TikTok, so schmotzies.
Mm.
So um, yeah, just wanted to add in that part.
No, I mean, I 100% agree. Unfortunately, I was not too surprised to see those numbers, of Israeli society. The entire, within Israel, the entire protest movement against this G side has been on the basis of the Israeli prisoners of war and not about the tens of thousands, probably over 100,000 people, who have been unalived by their state, by their government, right? They clearly don't care at all. And this and yeah, exactly like you said. I mean, this is an apartheid regime, right? The way apartheid in colonialism is justified is through dehumanization, right? And in Israeli society, Palestinians have been completely dehumanized. And so yeah, unfortunately, I was not too surprised to see those numbers, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think this was a great interview. Thank you so much, Nor, for being here. This really, makes me so happy. And thank you everybody for being in the chat and sharing the live. You guys did a lot of work down there too. We got to acknowledge that. I really appreciate it. This will be on my YouTube, and we'll post clips of it and all this sort of stuff like this. Um, so yeah, yeah, I hope to do many more interviews in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so
Bye bye.
much. Bye bye. Um, okay, guys. I think we'll end the live here. But many thanks, many thanks. We'll be back again soon. This has been Lord of Melon. Peace. Free Palestine. Free the world.